today's session, I'm checking out Microsoft identities and, most importantly, some of the tools and technologies that we can use to protect them. So if you're ready to learn, let's dive in.
Learn with Andy Malone.
Today's video is sponsored by SquareX for the ultimate in browser detection and response. Visit them today at squarex.com. With identity attacks ever increasing in the cloud, it's super important that administrators understand some of the protection mechanisms as well as some of the tools and technologies that Microsoft have got in place to help you protect your users and your tenant. So in this week's episode, I'm going to walk you through what I think are some of the most important settings that will hopefully help you protect against these malicious attacks. Now, if you've not subscribed, we'd love you to come on board. So bump that subscribe button and ring the bell and you'll be notified of any new video postings. And if you've got comments and questions, as always, we love those. So please, of course, get those down below. So I think without any further ado, let's jump in and take a look at these great identity protection mechanisms that are inbuilt into Microsoft Entra ID as well as Microsoft 365. Check it out. Let's start off in Entra ID for my session on identity protection. And a good place to start is identity protection. So I'm going to go in here, and what we have generally is we have a dashboard at the moment. There's not a lot going on here. Typically, this is all about risk management. Why do we need risk management in a company? Because ultimately we want to implement controls to reduce risk. And those controls can be technical. In this case, they can be administrative, so policies and procedures, as well as physical controls as well. So typically what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the mechanisms that are included in Entra ID to help us protect your users. So first up, of course, we have conditional access. So with conditional access, if I just open up a regular user account here, what I'm going to do is just scroll up. I'm going to come into Entra ID, and if I go into my users here, you can see that in my users I have a number of users, and typically in here you would select a user, you would choose how you want that user to sign in with a strong password, or in our case now multi-factor authentication, or maybe even something a little bit stronger like phishing resistant credentials. So yes, authentication can definitely help. Now, there are a couple of few settings, though, that we need to get in place in order to secure our environment. So, for example, in user settings here, so one of the things you can control are the default user role permissions. I'll just zoom in there a little bit more. So, for example, things like default user permissions. Do you want your users to be able to register applications? Do you want to restrict admin users from creating tenants? And look, it's set to no. So again, you might want to obviously switch that on. Do you want your users creating security groups? So these are, again, really important questions we need to ask. In terms of guest users, are you going to allow guest users in your organization? So guest users by default obviously don't have the same permissions as member users do, but you can elevate them. So again, do you want them to just see their own properties, the properties of other users, for example, in a group or a team, or everyone's properties? So again, important questions that need to be asked. And super important, right down at the bottom of the page, is this one. This is a huge no-no, in my opinion. Show keep user signed in. So whenever you sign into Microsoft 365 or another portal, have you noticed that checkbox that says keep me signed in? You absolutely want this to be off. Oh my goodness me. Okay, so again, you want to click on save and make sure that that's actually off. Now, I've just shown you some user properties, but what about guests? So we mentioned guests, but if I go into manage collaboration settings, you can see that you get the same guest options here, but more importantly, you also have the guest invite settings. So who can invite guests? Well, by default, and get this, anyone in the organization can invite guests, including guests. Oh my goodness me. Absolutely not. So member users and users assigned to specific admin roles, i.e. the guest inviter role, the global admin and the user admin will be able to invite guests. Only users in specific admin roles. So in other words, not necessarily member users, but owners, and no one. So you want to keep it absolutely secure and keep your guests out of your tenant. So again, really super important settings. The other thing as well, do you want your users to be able to leave? So if I just go into my user account here, in my user account, you will notice that we have an organizations tab. So within this organizations tab, any organizations that you've got guest access, the user can then click on, I want to leave that organization. So again, you may not want the user to be able to do that. Okay, so those are the basic guest and external access settings. So again, really useful tips there. So just before we go any further, I want to quickly jump in and just say a huge thank you to today's sponsor, SquareX. They offer some awesome security tools in terms of in-browser protection, detection, and response. Check them out today at squarex.com. Absolutely awesome. Let's continue. But what else can we do to secure our environment? Well, other things that we can do, we can definitely come into the likes of, let's say, SharePoint. So SharePoint, of course, is where all our files and folders and everything are stored in Microsoft 365. So, for example, in here, we have this policies area and sharing. And again, this is the default setting. I've changed it, but this is the default. Anyone can share anything. So those guests that I was just talking about, if you share with a guest, they can then go and share the document. Oh my goodness, you would very quickly lose control. So again, new and existing guests, that's probably a good place to be, as opposed to only people within your organization. Now, this is the tenant setting. So once you've set it at the tenant setting, you can then go into your subsites, for example, here. And if you go into settings, and you can see that you've got external file sharing here. And if I scroll down, you can now see that at anyone is actually disabled. So again, really small things, but super important at protecting your users. So now we come to Entra ID, and we're coming back into Entra, and I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to come to that ID protection. So what are some of the things that we can do in order to protect our users' identities? Well, you can use conditional access. Now, conditional access normally is a P1 license. So if you've got Business Premium, an E3 license, and so on, then you can use conditional access. But if you want to take advantage of ID protection, this is a P2 license. So again, you need to elevate that license. Now, with this, typically what we have, you can come into identity protection, and I can say, my risky users, for example, I can say, okay, in identity protection, I want to come in and I want to create a list of who are your risky users. So you can create what we call a user risk policy. Now, in this example here, Microsoft, this is a default setting, all users are risky. I don't see the point of that. Typically, rather than doing all users, what you might want to consider is only selected individuals. So, for example, let's say Adele, Alex, and let's say Alan were my senior management team. So they're super important. And of course, typically with that, they are going to be more risky than others. So I can say, well, based on that, what do I want to do? So based on that, user, I'm going to set the risk level for this user as, let's say, high, okay? Because ultimately, if anybody's going to get hacked, it's going to be management, it's going to be accounts, it's going to be administrators, it's going to be these sensitive roles. And more importantly, in terms of licensing, ladies and gentlemen, you only need 3 P2 licenses here, plus the administrator. So you don't need 1,000 licenses because you're only protecting these critical user accounts. So just be aware of that. So based on the risk level, if something doesn't look quite right, so impossible travel, they log on, for example, I'm in Oslo today, so they log on in Oslo, but they then log on in London 5 minutes later, and it's not a VPN, then what do you want to do? Do you want to reset the password? I don't see the point of this, to be honest. And I'm guessing that Microsoft will eventually remove that and put something else in. But now I don't want to allow access. I want to block access. So anything that doesn't look right, it's going to block access, and I'm going to enable that policy. Okay, so that's the user risk policy. So then we come to the sign-in risk policy. And again, what are the risks of signing in? So remote users signing in. So again, I'm just simply going to select our 3 members of management. I'm going to add them in. I'm going to say, am I going to assign them a risk level? So high risk. But this time, instead of blocking access, I'm going to allow access, but require multi-factor authentication. And again, I'm going to enable that, and I'm going to save that. Now, you know, initially when I saw that, I thought, yeah, that's nice, but it's not exactly does very much, does it? Well, you would be surprised. So if I come down here into, let's say, reporting, okay, so if I come into the reporting area here in monitoring, everyone has a sign-in log. Okay, so whenever you sign in into Microsoft 365 or Entra ID, there is always a sign-in log here. So in other words, when you sign in or when your users sign in, you can see it gives details of the user account, how the user is authenticating, the location that they're in, the device that they're logging in on, including the browser, how they're authenticating. So if it's using MFA or some other method, if you've got a conditional access policy, so in this case, this is a Microsoft applied one for admins. If you've got conditional access policies in reporting only mode, it shows you what would have happened here. And again, you've also got additional authentication events. So for example, with apps and things like that. So the sign-in logs are very, very useful. Now, if I come back in and go back into my identity protection, so you're probably thinking, well, you know, those risky users that I just set up, of course, I had those policies there, so I did the risky users. And now you can see that we would have an additional risky users report here. So, of course, I don't have any risky users, but the key thing is, if one of our high-risk users like Adele or Alan turned up here, what you could do is you could confirm this user has been compromised, or you could say dismiss it, or, you know, you could basically investigate it. So what's going on with this particular user? So that can be really useful. So again, it would tell you your risk detections. And what I really like about this is it's also been kind of integrated into the likes of conditional access as well. So if you've never used conditional access, this is an absolute godsend. It absolutely is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a conditional access policy here. So you can either create one from scratch, or you can use one of the policy templates. Only thing about the templates, I like them, don't get me wrong, but I just want a little bit more control. So I'm going to click on here. I'm going to create a new policy, and I'm going to call this my Oslo CA01. So my conditional access 01. I'm going to select my users. Now, top tip here, never select all users, because if you did and you made a mistake, you're basically screwed. So typically I'm going to select some users and groups, and what I'm going to do is I've got a user here called sales. I'm going to bring in a sales group, so let's bring in my sales team, and I'm going to do a conditional access policy for these guys. Now, as I've said previously, conditional access is all about signals. So in addition to authenticating with a username and multi-factor authentication or a password, it looks at additional signals. So if you're using a particular resource on a particular device in a particular location, you have to meet these requirements. If not, you're going to get locked out, or it might ask for some more details. So for example, I'm going to choose target resources. You can say all resources, all cloud apps, or you can select individual resources. Now, just a quick word of warning. You've got session controls here. Sometimes the session control issues a cookie, an authentication cookie, authorization cookie. Now, sometimes those cookies don't know the difference between all cloud apps and individual cloud apps. So just be aware of that, okay? So you might notice some features are not available, and it's because of that reason. Okay, so I'm going to choose a specific resource, and I'm going to just keep it simple today. I'm going to, let's say, for example, the Microsoft 365 admin portals and the Microsoft Office 365 login portals. So I want to protect those for my users, okay? So typically, that's what I want to protect. If you've got global secure access, you can, of course, configure specific networks, and you can use VPNs and things like that. The only thing that I've discovered is hackers are starting to get smart with this. So that being, they'll use VPNs to circumvent locations and things like that. So yes, it's nice, but again, there are other things that you can do as well. So I'm going to come down to conditions. And what do we see? Look at this. Here we go. User risk. So I'm going to say if my users are medium and high risk, and their sign-in risk is medium and high risk, okay? You can see here the little message, risk and sign-in risk in the same policy. Conditions, again, rarely occur together. So I'm just doing this just for demo purposes, but again, just be aware of that. If you're using Microsoft Purview's Insider Risk Management, you can integrate it with that. And this is what I love. I love things like the device platform. So what devices are your users using? We can even time travel back to the 90s with the Windows Phone. So I'm going to say any device. You can also select apps. So what kind of apps? So again, typically browser-based and mobile apps are what we're using. So I'm going to deselect these old legacy clients. The reason for that is because we don't want our users bypassing multi-factor authentication. So if you had a really old email system, it would be potentially a backdoor. By all means, do conditional access for it, but just do it in a separate policy, I would say. The next thing then is filter for devices. So again, to really enhance your security, ladies and gentlemen, I would definitely choose this model. So if you're deploying devices in Microsoft Intune, again, you can basically say, hey, okay, let's do a property. You can even do it by specific device IDs, so serial numbers. In other words, these are the only devices that you can log in on, okay? Make sure that the device is compliant. So you've got the latest patches, the latest updates. You might even say you've got physical IDs. I'm sure you get the idea. And you can use a combination of if and or. So for example, manufacturer equals Dell, the model equals XPS, and the device ID. So only these devices can connect to your environment. That is really, really powerful feature, by the way. Okay? So that is that. So I'll just say done here. Other things that we've got, authentication flows. So again, you've got to weigh up convenience against security. So with the convenience, of course, you can have a device code flow and an authentication transfer. So if you've signed in on your mobile device, you can then switch to a PC and continue. Again, depending on your situation, be very careful with that. Anyway, those are my conditions. So if the conditions are met, I'm going to say, yes, I want to grant access, maybe require multi-factor authentication, but you can also configure an additional authentication strength. So for example, an authentication strength, and I've covered these on previous videos, you can go in and you can set up, for example, passwordless MFA. So if you're using a FIDO key or something like that for these particular users. So again, very, very powerful. Okay, so for the purpose of this demo, I'll keep it as MFA. So other things as well, you can use these other options here, so you can have multiple controls or require all of the controls. Okay, so again, that's what I'm requiring. Finally, you've got the session control here. So the session control, use conditional access app options. So again, if you want to block downloads, prevent printing and things like that, that's quite useful. Very, very useful though is this one, the sign-in frequency. So this is forcing your users to periodically re-authenticate. So, I mentioned that keep me signed in. Did you know that actually that keeps you signed in for up to 90 days? So that's 90 days of unfiltered access. So do yourself a favor, maybe force your users to log on every 3 days at the most, or every 3 hours, or every hour, or every time they authenticate. And this would be very useful, for example, in a financial institution. Okay, so sign-in frequency, powerful. Now, because I've set the policy up, remember, for the admin portal and Microsoft 365, we have a feature here called the persistent browser. Now, as you can see, this isn't working. The reason for that is because you would need to choose all cloud apps for this feature. Continuous access evaluation, CAE, really useful, and what this does is it basically monitors all your security mechanisms, and if anything doesn't look right, it just kicks in and it says, hang on, would you mind just re-authenticating for me? Really important is token protection. So I've done in the past, I've done showed you token hacking and how you can bypass MFA. So typically with an authentication method, once you get that access token, and if you said keep me signed in, that can be stored in a browser. So there are a number of well-known attacks where hackers try and steal your access token, and they can just refresh that token, and you can basically give them access into your tenant. So require token protection, and essentially what this does, it makes every token unique. In other words, it prevents token replay. Extremely powerful feature. Okay, so you can see here it requires token protection for sign-in sessions only with supported devices and applications. Now, at the moment, that only works with Windows. Okay, Windows and Mac actually. Okay, so just be aware. So if I come back into my devices here, I've said any device. But actually, what you want to do is you want to set this device, let's say, for Mac OS and Windows, and you would then do a separate device or a separate rule for that. Now, I'm going to create this policy, but I'm going to run it in reporting only mode. And what that does, it gives you a try before you buy, and you can view, this is what it would have done before it goes live. Just to say that you can also use this, you have a what if tool as well. So the what if tool can be quite useful. Just quickly mention a new feature in Microsoft 360, in Entra ID, is the ability to now create a policy, but you can also delete that policy as well. And when you've deleted that policy, it goes into the deleted policies container. You can select it, and as you can see, you can then restore one of these policies. So if there's a policy here that's been deleted, you can restore that policy. That's a really, really nice feature. So there you have it. Some very useful tips and tricks for conditional access and identity protection. So just before we leave this, I'm just going to come back in here, just back into my dashboard. And if I scroll down, you've got a couple of little things here, settings. So if you do have hybrid, by the way, i.e. Active Directory on premises, definitely click this checkbox. Allow on-premises password change to reset the user risk. So in other words, it elevates the user risk. Again, very useful for identity protection. Finally, if you have an E5 subscription, and with the E5 subscription, one of the things that you get is protection mechanisms to protect your on-premises users as well. So again, coming into Entra ID, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to come into authentication methods. So a couple of really important settings here is password protection. So here we have a password policy, and of course you would never allow 10 attempts. You might only, let's say, allow 5 attempts, and let's say they can reset their passwords after 2 minutes. So down here, password protection for Windows Server Active Directory, and you can see this is on. Now what you need to do is click onto this little exclamation mark, click on Learn More, deploy the Entra password protection feature. Basically just scroll right down to the bottom of the page, and there's an agent that you need to install. So there's about 2 or 3 different PowerShell commandlets. Install those, download that agent, and this then becomes the primary policy protection. Finally, the last piece of advice that I can give you is if you are in hybrid and you do have an E5 license, what I want to do is just show you one more really super important tip. And you can find this in the security pane or Defender. So this is Defender XDR for Microsoft 365. And if you scroll right down to the bottom of the page, if you go into the system settings, and in here you can see identities. So you can click into identities, and you can see here we have a menu item that says sensors, and you can add a sensor, and this sensor you just simply download the installer, very simple to install, and during the process it will ask you, do you have an access key? You simply copy this, insert the key, and your Microsoft Defender, it will now start monitoring all the activity of your users on premises. So again, anything unusual, any kind of unusual behavior, it will start logging and monitoring that, and you would see those in the incidents and in the alerts, and you could then investigate it with your SOC team or Security Operations Center. So again, just a few super important things that you can do to protect your identities. Okay, so the final thing that I want to mention in this session is the authentication methods. So again, I'm just going to come back into my Entra, and in Entra, I'm going to scroll and we're going to talk about authentication methods. So some other things that you can do to protect your users. First of all, don't use SMS and voice calls as authentication methods. These can be circumvented potentially. You can switch on passkeys or FIDO keys. So just simply enable this for all users. You can configure this. You've got some options here. I'm just going to go with the default settings there. So FIDO or passkeys, this is phishing resistant credentials, i.e. when you use these, there's no username and password to steal. Of course, the Authenticator app is on by default, and the configuration, what this monitors is it monitors things like the name of the app as well as your location. This can be really useful because if somebody is in London and they suddenly get a message pop up that says, hey, you're trying to open Teams in Sydney, Australia, that's not right. Okay, so the Authenticator app is really, really useful there. Okay, other things that you've also got a temporary access pass. So this is used for new employees, so you don't give everybody the password. And also you've got other certificate-based authentication. So this is quite useful in the likes of Intune. You can deploy a certificate to the user's device, so it proves that the device is authentic. We also have a QR code. For example, if you're in a call center or you're just what we call a kiosk worker, i.e. you don't travel with your laptop, you're in a fixed location in a call center, then you can even now log on with a QR code. I've done sessions on authentication methods recently, so please make sure that you check those out. So there you have it, my tips and tricks for keeping you safe and not only your users, but also your tenants safe as well. I hope you found them useful. So there you have it, identity protection in Entra ID and Microsoft 365. Very, very small settings, but they can have a huge impact on your users as well as your tenant. Hey, listen, thanks for joining me this week. I really appreciate it. If you've got questions, as always, get those down below, and I'll see you next time.